My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 28, and I've spent the last 5 years working as an electrician here in Portland. Old houses, mostly. Wiring from the 60s that some inspector should have condemned years ago. It's not a job that gets you into nice rooms. My hands have small scars on them from box cutters and hot terminals. And by 6 o'clock most days my clothes smell like dust and burnt metal. I'm telling you this first because none of what happened later makes sense without it. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't think my life had room in it for a story like this one. Most evenings after a job, I'd stop at a coffee shop a few blocks from my apartment called the Copper Cup. I told people, and myself honestly, that it was because the coffee was strong and I liked sitting in the back booth where nobody bothered me. That part's true. It's just not the whole truth. The whole truth has a name. Mara Bennett. She worked the counter and covered the back tables, which is where I always sat. Whether that was luck or something else, I never asked myself too hard. She remembered I took my coffee black. She remembered I hated when the soup came out lukewarm and would send it back to the kitchen without me having to say a word. Small stuff. Waitress stuff, maybe, but it made a long day feel shorter. I liked her. I'd liked her for months. Maybe longer than I wanted to admit. I never said anything because I didn't know if she was seeing someone, and because I didn't want to be the guy who makes a waitress feel like she has to be extra nice to him for a bigger tip. So I kept it where it was. A few jokes over the menu. Nothing more. That was the arrangement, unspoken as it was, until one Thursday in early October. She came over to my table that evening and something was wrong immediately. Her smile was stretched too tight, like she was holding it up with effort. Her eyes were red, not crying right now red, but the kind that comes after crying somewhere private and trying to fix it with makeup that doesn't quite cover it. I set my cup down. Rough day. She opened her mouth like she was going to say she was fine. Then she looked at me and whatever she'd been holding together just cracked. She glanced toward the counter, checking if her manager was watching, then slid into the seat across from me. She'd never sat down at my table before. Not once. "Daniel," she said. Quiet enough I had to lean forward. "Can I ask you something really weird?" My heart started going faster than it had any business going. I kept my voice level. "Go ahead." She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together on the table like she was trying to physically hold the words in before they came out. Then she told me about a guy named Nathan. 3 years together. She thought they were headed toward something permanent. Marriage, a life, the whole thing. He left her for a woman named Vanessa. Someone with more money, nicer clothes, the kind of life he apparently decided he wanted more than the one he had with Mara. Now there was a wedding this weekend. An old friend of hers. And Nathan was going to be there. With Vanessa. And Mara didn't want to walk into that room by herself, and watch him look at her like leaving was the best decision he'd ever made. She stopped talking for a second. Took a breath. "You don't have to say yes," she said. "Seriously. Forget I even—" She stopped again, then made herself finish it. "Would you go with me? As my husband?" I didn't answer right away. I genuinely don't think I could have if I'd tried. My brain sort of stalled out. She read my silence as a no, and I watched her face fall. "Forget it," she said fast, already halfway out of the booth. "I don't know what I was thinking. I'm sorry, that was too much." I reached across the table and caught her wrist before she could stand all the way up. "Not hard. Just enough. I haven't said no yet." She stopped, looked at me like she wasn't sure she'd heard that right. I took a breath, trying to keep my voice from doing anything stupid, because my chest felt like someone had wrapped a hand around it and squeezed. "Before I answer," I said, "I need to know one thing." "What? Does this fake husband get to dance with his wife?" For a second she just stared at me. Then she laughed. Really laughed, even with her eyes still wet, and said, "Probably." I nodded. "Then I'm in." She looked at me for a long moment after that, like she couldn't quite believe I'd actually said yes. I looked back and tried not to let her see how long I'd wanted an excuse to stand next to her like that, even if the whole thing was pretend. When she got up to head back to work, her steps looked lighter than when she'd sat down. I stayed in the booth a while longer with my coffee going cold in front of me, running the whole conversation back in my head, trying to figure out how I just agreed to something this insane in under 2 minutes. I want to be honest about something. Some part of me, a small, dumb, hopeful part, already knew this wasn't just going to be one weekend and done. I didn't know how right that feeling was going to turn out to be, or how much it would end up costing both of us before it gave anything back. All I knew sitting there that night was that I wasn't about to let her walk into that wedding by herself. Everything after that I figured out as it happened. 3 days before the wedding, Mara handed me a small spiral notebook across her kitchen table and told me, dead serious, to memorize it. I laughed. She didn't. I'm not joking, Daniel. If someone asks you my mom's name and you blank, this whole thing falls apart. So I stopped laughing and we got to work. 2 nights, sitting at that table with takeout going cold between us, building a version of us that would hold up under questions from people who actually knew her. We landed on 8 months married, kept quiet because she didn't like turning her personal life into cafe gossip. The story went that we met when I came out to fix a busted panel in her kitchen. The wiring had been arcing behind the outlet by the stove, and things grew from there over a few months. I remember stopping halfway through reading that part back to her. Wait, that part's actually true. She looked up from the notebook. What? I did fix your panel. That arcing outlet by the stove, that was your place. I remember because you were arguing with the espresso machine the whole time I was under your sink. She blinked, like she was trying to place the memory and couldn't quite get there. I don't even remember that. I do, I said, and left it there, because I wasn't ready to explain just how long I'd apparently been paying attention. She studied me for a second too long. So you've been noticing me since then? I shrugged and looked down at the notebook instead of answering. She didn't push it, but I could tell she knew there was more to that shrug than I was saying. The morning of the wedding, I picked her up in a suit I'd borrowed from a friend named Rob, and it did not fit. The shoulders pulled wrong every time I moved my arms, and the shoes pinched in a way my work boots never did. My hands were scrubbed clean, but the calluses and the little white scars were still there if you looked. When she opened her door, she had on a simple green dress, hair pinned back, and I genuinely forgot what I was supposed to say for a second. She looked me up and down, a small, shy smile pulling at her mouth. You look different from the guy who sits in the corner drinking black coffee. Apparently fake husbands have a dress code, I said, holding out my arm. She looped her hand through it, and that one small point of contact went through me like a current. I remember thinking, right then, standing on her front step, this is going to be harder than I thought. I could play a part in front of strangers. I wasn't sure I could keep pretending my chest didn't feel like this. The venue was maybe 40 minutes outside the city, some renovated barn place with string lights. We hadn't been inside more than 20 minutes when I felt her whole body go rigid next to me. I followed her eyes and saw him. Nathan, tall, dressed like he wanted everyone to notice, with Vanessa on his arm in something that cost more than my truck payment. I leaned down close to her ear. Look at me, not at them. She dragged her eyes back to mine. I put my hand at the small of her back, steady, not pulling her anywhere, just there. You don't have to prove anything to him tonight. Nathan found us within about 5 minutes. His eyes went from Mara to me and back, doing some kind of math. When did this happen? He said. I didn't hear anything about a husband. I answered before she had to. We kept it quiet for a while. Mara doesn't like turning her personal life into a show for other people. That landed. His jaw did something tight, and he mumbled something about getting a drink and walked off. I stayed in character the rest of the night, pulled out her chair, remembered she hated cilantro when the catering came around, told our fake origin story to 3 different sets of relatives who asked. Somewhere in there, small true details started slipping into the fake ones without me planning it. The way she laughs when she's nervous. How she notices when someone's uncomfortable before they say anything. Later, after most people had a few drinks in them, one of her old friends, a woman I'd been introduced to 20 minutes earlier, leaned in loud and a little sloppy and said married people don't stand that far apart from each other. Said if we were really husband and wife, we should prove it. Mara went still next to me. Then she turned, voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it. We need to kiss, she said. Just to be convincing. I looked at her. My heart was doing something ridiculous. I hadn't planned for that sentence to come out of her mouth, Not there. Not with Nathan somewhere in that room probably watching. I nodded anyway. I leaned down slow, giving her every chance in the world to stop me if she wanted to. She didn't. It was quick, short enough to pass for a normal married couple kiss in front of a room of half-drunk wedding guests. But when I pulled back, neither of us moved for a second. Something had shifted. Small but real, and I don't think either of us knew what to do with it yet. She recovered faster than I did, laughed it off for whoever was still watching, played the happy wife bit like she'd been doing it for years. But under the table, her hand found mine, and it stayed there the rest of the night. I don't think anyone else noticed. I noticed everything. When the band slowed down for the first dance set, I stood and held out my hand. Does my wife feel like dancing? Only if my husband doesn't step on my feet, she said. And this time the smile actually reached her eyes. I put my hand on her waist. She put hers on my shoulder. We moved slow across the floor, and her cheek got close enough to mine that I could smell her shampoo. Something like vanilla. Faint. Nathan was off near the bar with Vanessa, but his eyes stayed on Mara the whole time. It made her shoulders tense up again for a second. I pulled her a little closer, and she looked up instead of at him. I almost forgot he was here, she said, quiet. Good, I said. Tonight isn't about him. By the time the reception wound down, Nathan looked genuinely miserable, like he couldn't work out how the woman he'd left was laughing with somebody else. I noticed, somewhere in the middle of that dance, that I'd stopped caring what he thought entirely. I only cared that her hand was still in mine. The drive back into the city was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as the drive out. Something had changed and neither of us said what. When I pulled up outside her building, she didn't reach for the door handle right away. She sat there with her purse in her lap, looking down at her hands. So, she said, our marriage is over already. Short, I said, but not terrible. She smiled at that, but her eyes held on mine a beat longer than the joke needed. You want to come up? I've got tea. Or wine, if tea sounds depressing after a wedding. I knew the smart answer was no. I said yes anyway. We ended up sitting on the floor of her living room, still in our wedding clothes, splitting cold leftovers straight out of the containers because neither of us wanted to bother with plates. There was nobody left to perform for. No Nathan. No Vanessa. Just the two of us and a quiet that had gotten heavier somewhere between the parking lot and her front door. She told me the worst part of losing Nathan wasn't actually losing him. It was believing she hadn't been enough, that if she'd been more polished, more put together, he never would have left. I felt something twist in my chest at that, something close to anger, but I kept my voice even. Him leaving doesn't mean you were missing anything, Mara. It means he never understood what he had. She looked at me for a long time after that. And what do you see? Could have kept it light. Made a joke, let the moment pass like 100 other moments had. Instead I told her the truth I'd been sitting on for months, that I noticed her the day I fixed her panel, that I paid attention to how she treated people even when nobody was watching her do it, that the kindness in her was rarer than she probably realized. Her eyes went glassy. Neither of us said anything for a second. I leaned in, slow again, same as before, giving her the same out. She didn't take it. I kissed her, and this time there was no crowd to convince and no story we needed to keep straight. Started careful, like we were both scared it might break if we moved too fast. Then her hands came up and grabbed the front of my shirt, and whatever restraint either of us had left just went. After that night, we stopped pretending any of it was about Nathan. She'd swing by job sites after her shifts with coffee from the cart on the corner. I'd wait outside the Copper Cup on nights she closed and we'd walk a few blocks talking about nothing. Foods we hated, bad clients, the little cafe she wanted to open one day with warm lighting and mismatched wooden tables. We never called it dating out loud. It didn't need the label. Every night we spent together felt like something that was already happening whether we named it or not. I remember thinking, somewhere in that stretch of weeks, that for the first time in a long time my life was actually moving somewhere good. I didn't see what was coming next. I wouldn't have believed it if someone had told me. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, and it nearly took me off a ladder. A contractor I hadn't worked with in 3 or 4 years, guy named Pete, good foreman, paid on time, was calling about a commercial build going up in Denver. Lead electrician position. Almost double what I was making in Portland, and real talk about a supervisor track if the first phase went well. It was the kind of offer most guys in this trade wait their whole careers for. I told myself I'd say no. I didn't even bring it up to Mara at first. Partly because I hadn't decided anything yet, partly because some part of me didn't want to test whether she'd ask me to stay. She found out anyway. Might have been a mutual friend in the trade, might have been she overheard something. She never told me exactly how, and by that point it didn't matter. I showed up at her place that evening and she already knew before I said a word. "Are you staying because of me?" she asked, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out how to say it honestly without it sounding like pressure. The pause went on a beat too long, and she read it as a yes. Something in her shut down, fast. Her voice came out colder than I'd ever heard it. "I think we let this go further than it was supposed to go," she said. "Maybe what I feel is just leftover stuff from Nathan. Maybe you were just the right guy at the right time." Something in my chest went tight. "Look at me, Mara. You don't have to say things like that just because you're scared." "I'm not scared," she said. "I'm being honest." "Then what was the kiss?" My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. "What were the last 3 weeks?" She wrapped her arms around herself and didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was steady even though her eyes weren't. "Maybe I just needed somebody after Nathan left. Maybe you were the right person at the right time, Daniel. That's all this was." That landed harder than I expected it to. I stood there trying to find the woman who'd leaned into me on that dance floor a few weeks earlier, and I couldn't find her in the person standing in front of me now. "You actually believe that?" I asked. She didn't take it back. She just told me to take the Denver job, not to throw away a real future over her. I laughed, short, ugly, not a sound I recognized coming out of my own mouth. "So that's all this was." She didn't answer. The silence did it for her. I left without saying anything else. Some part of me kept waiting the whole walk down the hallway for her door to open behind me, for her to say she didn't mean it. All I got was the sound of the door clicking shut. A few days later, I called Pete back and told him yes. I packed what I needed into 2 duffel bags, left the rest in a storage unit off 82nd, and drove east out of the only city I'd ever really lived in. The drive to Denver runs about 19 hours if you don't stop much, and I didn't stop much. I remember getting somewhere around Boise and realizing the weight in my chest hadn't moved an inch the entire drive. What I didn't find out until much later, Mara told me herself weeks after, was that the second her door shut behind me that night, she'd slid down against the wall in her hallway and cried until she couldn't get a full breath in. She hadn't pushed me away because she didn't love me. She'd pushed me away because she loved me enough to think she'd only end up holding me back from something better. I didn't know any of that yet, though. All I knew, somewhere on I-84 with the radio not quite cutting through the static, was that the one woman I'd let myself actually want had looked me straight in the eye and told me I didn't matter that much. And I'd been dumb enough to believe her. I'd been in Denver almost 2 months when Josie called, and I almost let it go to voicemail. The job itself was everything Pete promised. Long days on a 9-story commercial build downtown. Real responsibility. A crew that didn't question what I could do with my hands. There was talk, again, about moving me into a supervisor slot once the second phase kicked off. On paper, my life was going exactly the way it was supposed to. Every night, though, I sat on the edge of a bed in a rented 1-bedroom that still smelled faintly of fresh paint, staring at Mara's contact card, never once hitting call. I told myself she'd made it clear enough. I was a guy who happened to be standing there the one night she needed someone. Nothing more than that. Except every time I closed my eyes I saw her anyway. Her hand in mine on that dance floor, the sound of her laugh when I asked if the fake husband got to dance with his wife, the last thing she'd said to me standing in that hallway. "Maybe you were just the right person at the right time." That line followed me through every shift, every lunch eaten alone in the company truck. Back in Portland, Mara kept working her usual shifts at the Copper Cup, doing her best impression of someone who was fine. Josie, her closest friend, the one who'd known the marriage was fake from the very start, wasn't buying it for a second. Josie finally cornered her in the back hallway after a shift and asked, point blank, why she'd pushed me out the door. Mara started crying before she even got the answer out. I told him to go because I love him, she said. If he stayed because of me, he'd have ended up resenting it eventually. He had a real shot out there. I'm just a waitress with a broken heart and a dream that might not ever happen. Josie told her, flatly, that she was being an idiot, that what I felt for her had nothing to do with pity or bad timing. Mara wouldn't hear it. She kept repeating the same thing, like saying it enough times would make it true. What neither of them knew was that Nathan had been standing just around the corner the whole conversation, close enough to catch every word. The second he understood the marriage had been fake from day one, something clicked for him. If the husband thing was all an act, maybe she'd only been trying to make him jealous. Maybe there was still a door open. He started coming around the cafe more after that. First it was flowers left at the hostess stand with her name on the card. Then long apology texts about Vanessa, about how he'd made a mistake. One night he waited outside after closing, leaning against his car the way he used to when they were still together. I know everything now, he told her. I know Daniel wasn't really your husband. I know you were just trying to get through that wedding without looking pathetic. Mara went very still. You don't know anything, she said. He didn't drop it. Told her he and Vanessa were done, that he'd been wrong to think he needed someone flashier, that she was the only person who ever really got him. She told him to leave. He kept coming back anyway. Gentle about it, persistent, always finding a way to remind her that I'd left and he hadn't. That was around when Josie called me on the job site, my hands still covered in drywall dust, phone wedged between my shoulder and ear. I almost hit decline, figuring she was calling to reinforce whatever Mara wanted. Instead, the first thing out of her mouth was, Daniel, if you still love her, you need to come back. Now. I didn't say anything. She kept talking. Told me Mara hadn't pushed me away because she didn't care, that she thought she was protecting me, that she'd been crying on and off for 2 months and still was. Told me Nathan knew the truth now and had been circling her, that she was confused and hurting and genuinely believed I'd taken every word she said that night at face value. I stood there with my forehead against the cold metal of the truck door for a second, not saying anything, feeling every night I'd spent convincing myself she didn't want me start to come apart at once. She loves you, you idiot, Josie said, her voice cracking. She just didn't think she was allowed to keep you. I didn't wait to hear the rest. Told my foreman I needed a few days. Didn't even go back to the apartment to grab clothes. Just got in the truck and started driving. The drive from Denver back to Portland took me most of a day and into the night, and I spent all of it running back through every conversation Mara and I ever had. Every time she smiled at me across a table before any of this started. Every time she leaned into me like she actually trusted me to hold her up. It was already dark by the time I hit the city limits. I drove straight to the Copper Cup instead of going home first. Through the front window I could see her behind the counter, still in her work shirt, and Nathan standing across from her holding a bouquet, talking fast like he was scared she'd walk away mid-sentence. Parked, got out, walked in. The bell over the door did its usual chime. Mara turned around. When she saw me, her eyes went wide and her mouth opened, but nothing came out right away. Daniel. Nathan turned too, and whatever he'd been saying died in his throat. What is he doing here? I didn't look at him, just her. After 2 months of telling myself she didn't want me, I was standing in the same room as her again, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. I need to talk to you. She had both hands braced on the edge of the counter, knuckles pale. Daniel, let me talk first, I said, because last time, I listened to what you said instead of looking at what was actually going on in your eyes. Nathan started to say something, and I turned to him before he could get it out. Kept my voice low. It started fake. You're right about that. Then I looked back at Mara. But it stopped being fake for me a long time ago. Mara didn't even glance at him when she spoke. Leave, she said. Quiet. Steady. Mara, come on. Nathan's voice climbed. You can't be serious, right? I am. She turned to face him fully now. You heard him. It might have started fake, but it stopped being fake for both of us. You left when I loved you. He came back when he had nothing to gain from it. That's the difference between you two. Nathan's jaw worked for a second. He glanced at me, something ugly flickering behind his eyes, then back at her. An electrician, he said low. That's who you're choosing. She didn't flinch. He gives me peace. He respects me. He doesn't need me to be somebody else to deserve him. That's more than you ever gave me. Nathan stood there a few more seconds, breathing hard through his nose, before he set the flowers down on the counter and walked out. The bell rang once behind him and went quiet. The cafe felt too still after that. Mara and I stood a few feet apart, neither of us moving. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't started crying yet. I took one slow step toward her. You shouldn't have come back, she said, voice cracking on the last word. I had to. She shook her head. I said terrible things to you, told you that you were just a replacement, made you believe I didn't want you. I know, I said. I'm sorry too. I should have fought harder instead of just believing the worst thing you said. I was scared, she admitted, tears finally slipping down. I thought if you stayed because of me, you'd end up resenting it later. I thought letting you go was the only way to actually love you right. I closed the last few feet of distance and brushed a tear off her cheek with my thumb. You don't get to decide my future for me, Mara. Not even if you think you're protecting me. I know that now, she said. I was wrong. I hurt both of us because I got scared. Then, quieter, I love you. I loved you before I had the guts to say it out loud. You were never a replacement. I said that because it was the only way I could make myself send you away. I pulled her in and she came without hesitating, face pressed into my chest like she'd been waiting 2 months to do exactly that. I held on to her, one hand in her hair, the other flat against her back, and for the first time since that night in her hallway, I let myself actually believe she was standing there. We didn't rush anything after that. I kept the Denver job but switched to shorter contracts. A few weeks out, then back home, back and forth. It wasn't the easiest arrangement, but it worked, and we built the rest of it around that shape. We found a small space downtown a few months later, and I wired every outlet, every switch, every string of warm little bulbs that still hang over the counter of the cafe she'd been dreaming about since before I knew her. Almost a year after that wedding where we first pretended to be married, I stood in that same cafe after closing, the lights turned low, just the two of us. I got down on one knee between the wooden tables we'd picked out together and asked her to marry me. For real this time, no story to keep straight, nothing left to pretend. She said yes before I even finished the sentence. Some stories start with the truth. Ours started with a lie. Somehow, that lie is exactly what brought us home.